We've talked about a number of general types of memory and how they differ in the information processes they use. And the last of these general types is called procedural memory, and it's significantly different from the others. As you'll recall from earlier on in the course, procedural memory is the memory for skills. It was originally defined as the ability to remember motor skills like riding a bicycle, but it includes skills with a large cognitive component like playing a piano or operating a complex machine. Procedural memory is much more weakly connected with speech than semantic and episodic memory types. If you remember, recall of facts and events are called declarative memory because they're often expressed verbally or declared, while on the other hand, it's notoriously hard to describe exactly how we perform a skill. And one other difference, episodic memory can access different events that took place on different past occasions, but we're not able to perform skills at skill levels we had in the past. We can only access our current skill level. We don't remember how to perform a skill exactly as we did it in the past. Another big difference between procedural and declarative memory is that patients with damage to their hippocampal system, who've lost all ability to create new semantic and episodic memories, can still learn new skills, provided the skill doesn't require new declarative information. One such purely mechanical skill is mirror drawing, where you trace the outline of a figure when the figure and your hand are only visible in a mirror, so the required muscle movements are in the opposite direction to your visual perceptions. Amnesiacs, people who've lost the ability to create new declarative memories, show the same ability to acquire this skill as normal subjects, improving from session to session, even though each time they try, they've no memory of any earlier attempts. Another test in which amnesiacs show undiminished learning capability is in recognizing real and meaningless words. In this test, subjects are shown a sequence of letter strings. Some are real words, others have appropriate linguistic structure but aren't real words. The time taken to identify whether the letter string is a real word or not is measured. When the same letter string is seen a second time, fairly soon after the first, word-non-word identification is about 1/10 of a second faster. So some kind of skill learning is taking place, and learning by amnesiacs is just as good as in normal subjects. So how can we account for these capabilities? Going back to the highest level brain architecture, 3 different types of information are recorded in 3 different anatomical locations. Information conditions are defined in the cortex-like structures coloured green in this diagram. Recommendation weights are learned in the red-coloured subcortical structures. And the orange-coloured cerebellum learns receptive fields that are effectively commands to carry out behaviours within frequently used sequences. The primary locations for learning associated with procedural memory are the subcortical structures and the cerebellum. In other words, for learning relatively simple new skills, prior experience may have already created cortical receptive fields that are adequate to discriminate between different circumstances in which different skill behaviours of the new type are appropriate. So learning the skill involves just adjusting the recommendation weights associated with those existing receptive fields, not making receptive field changes. For example, in the case of the mirror tracing task, past experience will have created receptive fields able to discriminate between different relative positions of your hand and some object or figure. So acquiring the skill means those unchanged receptive fields have to acquire recommendation strengths in favour of different muscle movements. And once a sequence of skill behaviours has been defined in the basal ganglia, the order and timing of the sequence can be taken over by the cerebellum. Cerebellar receptive fields that command individual behaviours of a sequence are large and very complex combinations of cortical receptive fields. The cerebellar fields may need to change to new combinations of cortical fields, but simple new behaviors may not need any changes to the cortical receptive fields themselves. So there are 3 brain regions that record different types of information. The cortex defines receptive fields that are the means to discriminate between circumstances in which different behaviors are appropriate. These receptive fields are physically recorded by pyramidal neurons, and the recording mechanism is changed to synaptic weights. The basal ganglia defines the behavioral recommendation weights associated with each cortical receptive field detection. These recommendation weights are physically recorded as synaptic weights onto projection neurons in the striatum that correspond with behaviors. The cerebellum records receptive fields that define the exact time when behaviors in frequently used sequences are initiated. In other words, commands to initiate each behavior at the right moment. And these receptive fields are recorded on Purkinje cells in the cerebellar cortex. And again, the recording mechanism is changed to synaptic weights. In all 3 cases, the critical information is recorded on synapses located at the tips of spines that extend out from the dendrites. And this physical isolation on spines means that the weight of one synapse can be adjusted independent of all the other synapses. Changes to cortical receptive fields are driven by the hippocampal system and confirmed by the midbrain dopamine neurons. Changes to recommendation weights in the striatum are managed by the midbrain dopamine neurons but don't depend on the hippocampal system. And changes to receptive fields of Purkinje cells depend mainly on the inferior olive, again with confirmation by the midbrain dopamine neurons, but once more don't depend on the hippocampal system. So damage to the hippocampal system only affects one of these 3 learning mechanisms. The recommendation weights that are critical for procedural memory are adjusted by mechanisms that are actually very similar chemically to those that define cortical receptive fields. One striatal projection neuron corresponds with one behavior and gets lots of cortical inputs, each with a synaptic weight that can be individually adjusted. And that synaptic weight is the recommendation weight of the cortical receptive field in favor of the behavior. As in cortical pyramidal neurons, synaptic weights are increased if an input to the synapse contributes to the firing of the target neuron, the timing-dependent weight change mechanism. If an action potential arrives a little before the striatal neuron fires, its weight is increased. But the increase only persists if there's a reward signal, much as in the cortex. If there's a burst of dopamine firing, this is a positive reward signal and the increase is made permanent. But in the case of the striatum, there's a positive mechanism for reducing synaptic weights. There are cortical receptive field detections that correlate with negative consequences following a recent action. Then there are neurons in the striatum that correspond with the behavior of reducing the weights of recently active synapses onto recently active striatal neurons. So detection of the cortical receptive fields have recommendation weights in favor of the synaptic weight reduction behaviors. And the behaviors are implemented by briefly reducing the level of background dopamine in the striatum, which affects the recently active synapses. And just for interest, after selections of these weight reduction behaviors by the usual basal ganglia processes, the implementations go via a brain structure that we haven't discussed, called the habenula, which has been shown to play a role in negative rewards. But we're not going to discuss the habenula in any detail. We've already talked about the issue associated with creating new dendritic branch conditions onto cortical pyramidal neurons. The problem being that there isn't time for the brain to create physical connectivity on the fly when it's needed. So provisional connectivity has to be created in advance that's as good an estimate as possible for what will be needed. And an analogous problem exists for procedural memory. Many different receptive fields might be appropriate for recommending any one behavior, but a receptive field can only acquire recommendation strength in favor of the behavior if it has a synapse onto the corresponding striatal neuron. Providing connections from every receptive field to every behavior would be very costly and very wasteful in resources. So provisional connectivity tends to be established if the receptive field was active just before the behavior was selected in the past. That kind of temporary correlated activity implies that there's a good chance the receptive field would be useful for determining when the behavior will be appropriate in the future. And as we discussed for the cortex, in sleep there's a partial rerun of past experience, which can provide the information needed to guide the selections of provisional connectivity. So now in the next sections, we'll take these information processes that we've been discussing and look at how they can be applied to understanding different types of procedural memory phenomena.